In the days after the killing, one phrase kept resurfacing in accounts of Pastor Elias Trammell's thinking, the belief that he was being tested. Not by the people around him, not by circumstance or consequence, but by God himself. It was a conviction that transformed a moment of accountability into something far more dangerous, an internal trial where doubt became disobedience, and resistance became proof. For years, Elias Trammell had spoken about faith as something quiet and grounding. He preached humility, stewardship, and service, often emphasizing that leadership was not about authority, but responsibility. Those who listened saw a man who framed belief as a shared journey, not a personal calling above others. That image would make what followed not just shocking, but deeply unsettling. Because when investigators later examined his sermons, his journals, and his behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime, they found a shift that was easy to overlook in real time, but impossible to ignore in retrospect. The language had changed. References to community slowly gave way to references to purpose. Humility blurred into certainty. And faith, once described as something lived alongside others, became something Elias increasingly positioned himself at the center of. This story is not about a sudden snap or a single moment where everything went wrong. It is about accumulation, pressure layered on pressure, financial strain colliding with spiritual authority, a mind unraveling in a way that still allowed Elias to function publicly, to preach, to lead, and to reassure those around him that everything was under control. The danger was not chaos, it was coherence built on a false foundation. When a close friend eventually confronted him about missing church funds, the confrontation did not register as concern or accountability. In Elias's mind, it became something else entirely. A test. A challenge to his resolve. A moment where he believed obedience mattered more than explanation, and conviction mattered more than consequence. That belief would become the lens through which he justified what he did next. True crime stories often focus on the act itself, but this case resists that simplicity. The most unsettling questions live earlier, in the quiet months when warning signs blended into normalcy, in the trust placed in a leader who seemed unshakable, in the hesitation of a community taught to see doubt as weakness and questioning as betrayal. What makes this case so disturbing is not just that a pastor killed a friend. It's how belief, stress, and unchecked authority aligned in a way that felt meaningful to the person committing the act. How a sense of divine purpose replaced moral restraint. And how easily that transformation went unnoticed until it was irreversible. This is the story of Pastor Elias Trammell. And it begins not with violence, but with belief. Eli Grant did not die in isolation because he was reckless or callous. He died in a place designed for passing through, a space where anonymity is expected and silence is normal. The motel room was not hidden. It was visible, accessible, and surrounded by people. And yet, what happened inside it went unnoticed until routine exposed what violence had carefully concealed. This case is a reminder that the absence of noise does not mean the absence of harm. The crime succeeded not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it blended seamlessly into everyday life. Thin walls, shared hallways, and constant movement created the illusion of safety, even as someone exploited those same conditions to remain invisible. The investigation succeeded for the opposite reason. It slowed down. It paid attention to records no one thinks twice about and objects no one remembers. A duplicate ID photo. A torn fabric tag. Details so ordinary they almost disappeared. In the end, It wasn't force or urgency that brought answers, it was patience. Eli Grant's story raises uncomfortable questions. How many crimes rely on the expectation that no one is really watching? How often does routine dull awareness, allowing something deliberate to pass as unremarkable? And how many answers are hidden not in dramatic moments, but in the smallest pieces of evidence left behind? If cases like this matter to you, cases where truth emerges not from spectacle but from careful investigation, consider subscribing to Beyond the Evidence. And if this story made you think differently about the spaces we move through every day, share your thoughts. What stood out to you most about how this crime unfolded? And what do you think ultimately broke the silence? Elias Trammell did not lead in isolation. His authority was reinforced by relationships built over years, not just from the pulpit, but in quieter, more personal spaces. Among those relationships was a close friend who had known Elias long before his role as pastor fully defined him, someone who understood both the man and the mission, and who remained involved as the church grew. This friend was not an outsider or skeptic. He was embedded in the life of the church, familiar with its finances, its operations, and its values. The relationship between the two men was marked by mutual respect rather than hierarchy, which made it distinct from Elias's relationship with most congregants. When concerns eventually arose, they came from a place of shared responsibility, not opposition. Within the church, loyalty was both cultural and spiritual. Members were encouraged to support one another, to resolve concerns internally, and to avoid gossip or public disagreement. These values fostered closeness, but they also created an environment where hesitation felt virtuous. Questioning leadership, even gently, carried an unspoken risk of being seen as lacking faith. As Elias's role expanded, so did the subtle power imbalance in his relationships. Friends became parishioners. Advice began to flow more in one direction than the other. Even those closest to him noticed that it was harder to challenge his decisions without the conversation taking on spiritual weight. What might have once been a practical disagreement increasingly felt like a theological one. Silence played a critical role during this period. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of trust. Small inconsistencies were noticed, but they were rationalized. Behavioral shifts were attributed to stress, workload, or the burden of leadership. Those who might have spoken sooner chose patience instead, believing that support mattered more than scrutiny. For his friend in particular, this dynamic created tension. He was close enough to see changes others could not, yet bound by loyalty and shared history. The longer concerns went unaddressed, the heavier they became. What began as unease slowly transformed into responsibility, the sense that saying nothing was no longer neutral. These dynamics matter because they reveal how danger can grow in plain sight. Not through malice or neglect, but through care and restraint. The same qualities that held the community together, trust, respect, and loyalty, also delayed confrontation until it could no longer be avoided. By the time that confrontation came, it carried the weight of months of unspoken concern. And it would collide with a mindset that no longer interpreted challenge as care, but as threat. The first signs of change did not arrive as red flags. They came quietly, woven into routines that already felt familiar. Elias Trammell was still preaching every week, still leading prayer, still speaking about faith and service. But over time, the emphasis of his message began to drift in ways that were difficult to name, let alone challenge. Sermons that once centered on collective responsibility slowly narrowed toward personal conviction. Elias spoke more frequently about being called and less about being accountable. He framed challenges as spiritual resistance rather than practical obstacles, and setbacks as tests rather than problems to be solved. To many listeners, this sounded like passion. To a few, it felt like something else, though they struggled to articulate why. At the same time, financial pressures began to mount. The church was facing declining donations and unexpected expenses, and Elias took on more responsibility in response. Where oversight had once been shared, decision-making became increasingly centralized. Reports were delayed. Questions were answered with reassurance rather than detail. None of this appeared alarming on its own, but together, it marked a shift away from the transparency Elias had once championed. Those closest to him noticed changes beyond the pulpit. He slept less. He spoke faster. His certainty intensified, even when discussing complex or unresolved issues. Conversations that once welcomed dialogue became one-sided, framed by an urgency that left little room for disagreement. When concerns were raised, Elias often responded with confidence that bordered on impatience. What made these warning signs so difficult to confront was their ambiguity. Increased intensity can look like dedication. Spiritual language can obscure emotional volatility. And within religious communities especially, confidence is often mistaken for clarity. Few wanted to be the one to suggest that something deeper might be wrong. For his close friend, the unease became harder to ignore as financial inconsistencies surfaced. Missing funds, unexplained transfers, and vague explanations accumulated into a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as oversight. Still, confrontation was delayed, in part because of the weight of their history, and in part because Elias framed his actions as necessary sacrifices for the church's survival. The inciting moment was not the discovery of a single irregularity, but the realization that silence was no longer protecting anyone. What had once felt like patience began to resemble complicity. The decision to confront Elias was not made lightly, and it was driven less by suspicion than by concern. By the time that confrontation was set in motion, Elias's internal narrative had already shifted. Accountability was no longer a neutral concept. It had become something to overcome. And in his mind, the line between faith and defiance was about to be tested. By the time the confrontation arrived, Elias Trammell was no longer operating from the same psychological ground he once had. The financial strain on the church had intensified, and with it, his sense of personal responsibility. What had begun as pressure gradually hardened into something more rigid, a belief that the survival of the church and his role within it rested solely on his resolve. In the weeks leading up to the crime, Elias's thinking became increasingly binary. Problems were no longer complex, they were spiritual. Opposition was no longer disagreement, it was resistance. According to later evaluations, this period was marked by classic signs of a manic episode: racing thoughts, reduced need for sleep, inflated confidence, and a deepening conviction that his actions carried divine significance. Importantly, these changes did not render him outwardly incoherent. He continued to function, preach, and lead, which made the internal collapse far harder to detect. The misuse of church funds existed within this distorted framework. Elias did not view the money as stolen or mismanaged, but as temporarily redirected for what he believed were righteous ends. Each decision reinforced the next, forming a closed loop where necessity justified secrecy, and secrecy reinforced the sense of being uniquely burdened. Outside input became increasingly irrelevant. When his friend finally confronted him, the moment Elias had been avoiding became unavoidable. But instead of grounding him, the confrontation accelerated his internal narrative. Later statements would reveal that he experienced the encounter not as concern, but as a challenge to his faith. In his mind, this was not about finances, it was about obedience. Mental health experts later described how religious delusions can intensify during manic episodes, particularly when authority and stress are involved. Elias's belief system did not collapse, it narrowed. The world reduced itself to a test of resolve, and his friend became, symbolically, the embodiment of that test. Accountability was reinterpreted as betrayal. Resistance became proof. The crime itself occurred in this psychological state. It was not impulsive in the sense of confusion, but it was deeply distorted. Elias acted under the belief that he was being measured, that hesitation would mean failure, and that the consequences he feared was secondary to the conviction he believed he was meant to demonstrate. The act was swift, fatal, and irreversible. There is no need to describe the violence in detail to understand its gravity. A life was taken. A trust that had spanned years was shattered in seconds. And the belief that guided Elias in that moment did not protect him from reality. It severed him from it. In the immediate aftermath, Elias did not flee. According to investigators, he appeared calm, even resolute. He spoke in spiritual terms, framing what had happened as something he had been led through rather than something he had chosen. This posture would later become central to understanding both his mental state and the depth of his disconnection from consequence. The escalation ends here, but the damage does not. What followed would force a community, and eventually a court, to confront the uncomfortable intersection of faith, mental illness, and responsibility. News of the killing spread quickly, but understanding lagged behind it. For those who heard the initial reports, the details felt incompatible with the name attached to them. Pastor Elias Trammell was not someone the community associated with violence, let alone the deliberate killing of a friend. The gap between who he was believed to be and what he had done created a kind of emotional paralysis. In the hours that followed, reactions were fragmented. Some struggled to accept the facts at all, searching for alternative explanations that might soften the reality. Others focused on procedural details, timelines, locations, logistics, as a way to avoid confronting the meaning of the act itself. Shock became a buffer, allowing people to function while the weight of what had happened remained suspended. Within the church, the silence was immediate and profound. Regular gatherings were canceled. Messages went unanswered. The pulpit, once a place of guidance and reassurance, stood empty. For many congregants, that absence was more unsettling than any statement could have been. It forced a confrontation with uncertainty at a time when clarity felt desperately needed. Denial surfaced not as refusal, but as defense. Some clung to the version of Elias they had known, insisting that something external must have caused the rupture. Others emphasized his mental state, not to absolve him, but to preserve a sense of order, to believe that the violence came from illness rather than intention. These reactions were not contradictory. They were human attempts to restore coherence after sudden loss. The family of the victim faced a different reality. For them, there was no abstraction, no theological framing that could soften the outcome. A life had ended, and the person responsible was someone they had trusted. Grief was compounded by betrayal, and morning unfolded under public scrutiny that offered little privacy or relief. As law enforcement secured the scene and began formal proceedings, the community was left in a state of suspension. Questions circulated quietly. How long had this been happening? Who should have seen it? What did faith mean now? There were no immediate answers, only a growing awareness that the story extended far beyond a single act. In the days that followed, disbelief gave way to reckoning. The need to understand how this could happen and whether it could happen again began to eclipse the initial shock. And with that shift, attention turned from reaction to investigation. As the investigation moved forward, it became clear that understanding what happened would require more than reconstructing the final moments. Investigators widened their focus, examining months of financial records, sermon transcripts, personal writings, and witness accounts. The goal was not only to establish what Elias Trammell did, but how his thinking had evolved to the point where the act became possible. Financial analysis confirmed irregularities that aligned with the concerns raised before the killing. Church funds had been redirected without proper authorization, often justified internally as temporary measures or emergency decisions. While the amounts varied, the pattern was consistent. Transparency diminished as Elias's control increased. These findings established motive, but they did not fully explain intent. More revealing were the changes in Elias's language over time. Investigators and later expert witnesses noted a gradual shift in his sermons and writings, from shared belief toward personal elevation. References to collective faith were replaced with assertions of individual purpose. Elias increasingly framed himself as uniquely positioned to endure trials others could not, a hallmark of grandiosity rather than leadership. Mental health evaluations provided a critical framework for interpreting these changes. Experts identified a manic episode characterized by elevated mood, reduced need for sleep, racing thoughts, and an inflated sense of mission. Financial stress acted as a catalyst, while Elias's role as a spiritual authority shaped the content of his delusions. Rather than incoherent beliefs, his thinking remained structured, making it all the more dangerous. Crucially, these findings did not suggest a loss of awareness about his actions. Elias understood what he was doing in a practical sense, but his moral reasoning was compromised by a belief system that reframed accountability as persecution. In this state, opposing voices were no longer safeguards. They were obstacles to be overcome. This distinction became central to legal proceedings. The court was tasked with weighing psychological impairment against responsibility, a balance that offered explanation without erasure of harm. Expert testimony clarified that mental illness could influence perception and judgment without eliminating agency entirely. For the community, these revelations were destabilizing. They challenged simple narratives of good and evil, forcing a confrontation with the reality that harm can emerge from familiarity, trust, and untreated vulnerability. The investigation did not provide comfort, but it did offer clarity, revealing how the warning signs fit together once they were finally seen in full. By the time the investigative phase concluded, the story had shifted. It was no longer only about a crime, but about the systems, personal, spiritual, and institutional, that failed to interrupt its trajectory. The legal consequences unfolded with a sense of inevitability, but not simplicity. Elias Trammell was held accountable for the killing, with the court acknowledging the role of mental illness without allowing it to eclipse responsibility. The sentence marked a formal end to his authority, but it did little to resolve the damage left behind. For the church, the impact was immediate and lasting. Attendance dropped sharply, not out of protest, but confusion. Some members left quietly, unable to reconcile their faith with the betrayal they felt. Others stayed, determined to separate belief from the man who had once represented it, even as they struggled to articulate what that separation looked like in practice. Leadership structures were dismantled and rebuilt. Financial oversight became stricter. External accountability was introduced. These changes were necessary, but they carried a heavy emotional cost, serving as constant reminders of why they were needed. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned deliberately and transparently. The victim's absence remained the most profound consequence. His family continued to grieve privately while the community processed publicly, a contrast that underscored how uneven the burden of loss can be. There were no rituals or resolutions that could restore what had been taken, only the slow work of acknowledging harm without trying to explain it away. Beyond the church, the case prompted broader conversations among faith leaders and mental health professionals. Questions emerged about the pressures placed on leaders, the stigma around psychological struggle, and the risks of equating certainty with spiritual strength. The tragedy became a reference point, not as an anomaly, but as a warning. In the end, the consequences were not confined to a verdict or a sentence. They lived on in altered beliefs, fractured relationships, and a community forced to rebuild its foundation with greater caution. What had once felt permanent was now understood as fragile. The story of Pastor Elias Trammell does not end with a sentence or a closed case file. It lingers in the quieter questions that remain about how authority reshapes perception and how pressure can distort even deeply held values. What happened was not the result of a single failure, but of many small moments where concern was softened by trust and warning signs were reframed as dedication. This case forces a difficult reflection on leadership itself. Positions of influence often come with expectations of strength and certainty, leaving little room for vulnerability. When stress and instability take hold in those roles, they can go unnoticed longer, shielded by respect and belief. The danger is not belief alone, but belief insulated from challenge. Mental illness does not announce itself clearly, especially when it adopts the language already valued by a community. In Elias's case, spiritual conviction became the vehicle for psychological collapse, allowing harmful ideas to feel purposeful rather than alarming. Understanding this does not excuse the harm, it clarifies how it was able to happen. For the community left behind, the reckoning continues. Faith, for many, was not abandoned, but it was altered. It became more cautious, more questioning, and more aware of the need for shared accountability. The tragedy reshaped not only how leadership was viewed, but how silence was understood. Cases like this invite all of us to look more closely at the systems we rely on, to ask where responsibility is concentrated, where support is absent, and where questioning is quietly discouraged. They remind us that prevention often lives in discomfort, in the conversations that feel intrusive, disloyal, or unnecessary at the time. As you reflect on this story, consider the spaces in your own life where authority goes unchecked, or where concern is withheld out of respect. What warning signs are easy to overlook when someone is trusted to lead? And how might accountability, offered early, change an outcome before belief hardens into something irreversible?